No, I wasn't prepared for the dance. Can you please give us a demonstration? Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Johnson. I'm professor in the Department of Public Policy, Public Affairs, and I'm chair of Charla Burnett's Dissertation Committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to her dissertation defense. I'm so happy that you could take time to listen to all that Charla has to share with all of you. The dissertation committee consists of myself, Sam Barkin, professor in resolution concerning local governance, and Will McClintock, project scientist, University of California, Santa Barbara, who we consider an external member. That's the three of us. And I understand the agenda will be as follows. We'll have Charla present her dissertation findings for 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll follow that with questions from the audience for perhaps another half an hour. And then we'll transition to an oral exam, which will be just the committee of three in Charla for maybe another half an hour. And then the committee alone will discuss, and then we'll invite Charla back in, and then open it up to everyone else. Is that okay, Sammy? All right, so thank you very much. I'd like to turn it back over to Charla, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to me in person, and those of you on Zoom. I really appreciate you being here. This is actually the first in-person dissertation since COVID for my department. So if there's any hiccups in technology, we're really sorry. Just make sure to let us know down in the chat and we'll try to fix it in real time. Okay? So as you see, my dissertation is titled Participatory Mapping in Public Decision Making Using C-Sketch. And today we're going to talk about my research. And I'm going to really be focused on my contribution to the field and also my results. As my committee told me, I need to pretend that you all have read my 200-page dissertation, even though I know that's not true. But I hope that today we can talk a little bit and you will get more interested in this topic and perhaps will actually open up the document and read further. Because I'm obviously not going to be able to touch on every single detail that's in that paper in 20 to 30 minutes. All right. First off, before I begin, I really just want to thank everyone. 30 years ago, someone like me wouldn't be here today. I grew up in a trailer park with parents, one who didn't graduate from high school, another one who got expelled from high school. No one in my family ever went to college. So the fact that I'm here, tattoos, piercings, slightly queer, is a huge feat in academia. And I just feel like it's a privilege for me to be able to talk to you today about this really important topic that's obviously way more important to me than it is you. But I really want to thank my committee members who have all been here to mentor and guide me. I want to thank Karen Ross and Peggy Carnes, who have been amazing mentors to me in other research and just in life in general. I want to thank my family and friends who have been supportive of me through this journey, this 6.5-year journey. The times that I missed family gatherings and friends' birthdays to be able to study and be able to work on this. I just want to thank you for your sacrifice. I also want to thank the International Society of Participatory Mapping that I co-founded with Rudar Kemper. I wouldn't be here without you, and I wouldn't have been able to connect with the hundreds of participatory mapping researchers without this society. So thank you. And of course, UMass Boston and the Harvard Kennedy School for providing me with funding to be able to implement this research. And last, of course, the people of Bermuda, who welcomed me with open arms in the middle of political conflict conflict in the middle of the disaster that was Hurricane Irma, and still helped me move my research agenda along, even though it wasn't what they were interested in talking about at the time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here soon. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. So, like most traditional research, I started out by reading and thinking through my goals, creating a list of hypotheses to be tested. I also focused on, how can I contribute to my field? And then I focused on a literature review. And then I created a methodology and framework for measuring perceptions in participatory mapping. But I'm not going to bore you with all those finer details. I'm not really going to get too deep into my methodology today. You'll see in the handout that I have here, and which I can email out to those of you on Zoom, that kind of goes a little bit deeper into my research questions, the literature that I reviewed, the results are all kind of there for you in the structure of my research. This research took a really long time to implement because it's very complex and there's a lot of moving parts. So bear with me as I take you through this journey that was my PhD dissertation. So what is participatory mapping? Some people haven't heard of it. I presume a lot of you haven't. And in fact, it's rather disputed amongst those who practice and study it. The one thing that I do know for sure is that participatory mapping is a human dynamic that occurs when we share, whether orally or drawing on a floor, anything like that through maps, and how we transfer information to one another that somehow changes our behavior. Thousands of years ago, when our ancestors were roaming and hunting, they would sing songs and they would draw maps on the ground to tell their story and to tell where their community resources were and how they should be used. So this is a really kind of dynamic concept that doesn't necessarily have to do with technology, but for this specific dissertation, I focused almost entirely on the technology and whether or not this technology can enhance or inhibit participatory mapping outcomes. Now, it's also a kind of citizen science. How do citizens participate in science? How do they participate in methodology creation and design? The collection of data for human behavioral change. It's both urban and rural. It's also global. There's not a country on the planet that participatory mapping hasn't occurred in some shape or form. It's definitely interdisciplinary. I've met with environmental researchers, marine biologists, urbanists, urban planning specialists, indigenous specialists, and people trying to promote land tenure for indigenous citizens. So it spans across all disciplines, which is why it was so interesting to me, because at the root of it, I'm a methodologist. I want to see how we can best create methodology to be able to reach our goals. What's also interesting about participatory mapping is it's trans-organizational. So at every level of global international structures, there is participatory mapping, whether it's at the United Nations, the local government level, city planners, and like I said, all the way to civil society organizations, political organizing, all organizations use participatory mapping. So it's very important that we study it and make sure that we could use it in a way that enhances society instead of inhibits us. So evaluation. What are the change mechanisms of participatory geographic information systems? What are the elements that result in behavioral change? That's really what I wanted to understand. Because if this can be used as a transformational tool, then perhaps I can implement it in real life in a practical manner when I'm trying to reach my goals. Particularly, I work in international development. So when I engage local communities, I want to provide them with an array of different methods that they can choose from so that they can reach their goals. And a lot of times their goals because everything around resource management is political, is how do we distribute community assets? How do we make sure that the have-nots are not left behind and that we all kind of get our piece of the pie? Because that's what people really want in politics. So when we talk about evaluation, there's so many different methods that I could have used. But one thing that I've learned through other evaluation programs is that real-time research is needed to really assess this. And when I first set out to do this research, I was told that I would be able to assess a participatory mapping project in real time. And that's why I decided to pursue this research agenda. Now we'll talk a little bit today about how that changed and how dynamics in real time in our real lives can sometimes destroy a research agenda. You have to throw it out and start again and find really innovative ways to be able to ensure that you're still able to engage your questions. So what is C-Sketch? Because I'm sure you're wondering, well, how does that relate to participatory mapping and to my research? C-Sketch is a web-based participatory mapping platform that was specifically designed to help map coastal areas and create marine protection zones. When I first started working with C-Sketch at Will McClintock's lab at UC Santa Barbara, there was roughly only 3,500 users. We now have 9,000 users all across the globe. There's over 40 major projects that are being implemented by Will McClintock and his team in varying degrees of control. A lot of times people come to his company, they just want to use C-Sketch. They don't want to utilize the experience of the developers and the administrators. And so he doesn't really have much control over how participatory mapping is used and his software is used in different contexts. But for other projects, he has a little bit more control. He's able to advise, he's able to create best practices for the institution of what C-Sketch can do for marine spatial planning. So out of all of the different projects that Will McClintock is working on, you're specifically interested in Blue Halo. Now, Blue Halo is happening across 3 island nations. One was Barbuda as a part of the Twin Islands of Antigua Barbuda. One is Montserrat, and the other is Curacao. So my goal was that I would spend an entire summer studying in Barbuda, Montserrat, and Curacao. But that's not actually what occurred. So for us, marine protection zones are important because it ensures that we don't overuse our natural resources. As you probably know, we have an overfishing problem. We also have a pollution problem. And so in the Caribbean, a lot of these smaller communities' whole livelihoods are attached to their ability to be able to fish, to eat that fish, to sell that fish, to survive on a day-to-day basis. So Will's job and his team at C-Sketch is to go in and work with the community to better understand where they fish, how that impacts certain marine wildlife, and then to create these protection zones where maybe perhaps some of the fishermen only fish in these waters a certain amount of time over the season, or they only catch a certain amount of that wildlife and then they allow it to regrow and regenerate. So with his goal was to make sure that all the people in these island communities are able to sustain and live in that environment, which was really important to the people of Barbuda. So when everybody first walked in, I played this really beautiful video, using how lush and green and beautiful and vibrant the island is. At any given time, there was only about up to 2,000 people living on this island. The 24 square kilometer island, like you walk across it with it. Super tight, super connected with the environment. But when I got there, this is what I found. Hurricane Irma destroyed the island in 2017. It really ravished, and the local government in Antigua, they really want to exploit the Barbudan community and their land because they have a communal land system that protects them. So what that means is that every person born of Barbudan heritage gets a plot for their house, plot for their crops, fought for their other like cattle. So as long as you're Bermudan, you will always have a home. And some people on the island are very protective of that home. And they don't want Antigua to sell the property because right now, as a foreigner or someone who's not Bermudan, you can only lease the land. And this created a lot of political divides on the island between different governments who wanted to sell the property and have assets and become rich, and those who just wanted to live on their land, be left alone, live in harmony with nature. So it was really interesting when I got there because not only were they dealing with this disaster relief, but they were dealing with these internal political dynamics that really derailed Blue Halo and what was happening with Sea Sketch on the island. So instead of interview, which I was able to conduct a few interviews, just 5 full-length interviews with residents of Bermuda, because every time I tried to sit them down and talk to them about Sea Sketch, they're like, we don't care about this right now. We got bigger problems. They also said, I don't really remember I remember Blue Halo, I remember the process, I remember the administrators, but I don't remember the technology. Because for a lot of people, they might not have had a lot of access to the technology, to computers at all, very limited Wi-Fi on the island. So they didn't really actually use it with their hands. They didn't engage with the platform themselves. Instead, we had what we call chauffeurs or administrators would sit down with them and collect the data through them and then would be mapped onto Sea Sketch. So it's kind of a third party interaction. And I think that this resulted in them not really understanding the technology. They didn't really understand the results. From what I could gather, they were not happy with the marine protection zones, which to them, they felt like threatened their livelihood and made it more difficult for them to be able to provide for their families. And so you throw Hurricane Irma, this natural disaster, probably already caused by climate change, on top of it, and they really wanted nothing to do with my research. So I was like, how am I going to collect enough information to find anything worthwhile to answer my hypotheses? Well, at the end, I kind of didn't. And this happens a lot. I can speak more frankly here than I can in my writing, but the funders actually were not really happy with an evaluation because they knew that the people were not happy with what had occurred. They knew that they probably could have did a little bit more. They probably could have taught them how to use the technology more, invested more time in that, which is time and money. And then, of course, with the disaster, they kind of felt disconnected to the outcome and felt like they had no control anymore about whether or not people were actually going to use the plans that they had created. This was, a really long process, and they put a lot of money into it. So instead, I actually spent the summer going through rubble with the UN. Spent a lot of time getting bit by bugs, sleeping in a tent, and just really got to spend time with them at a level that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And so I could take some lessons back into my dissertation results, even though my methodology and what I had set out to do was no longer clear. Now, one of my major and probably most important results that I found is that, and this isn't necessarily something new, but it definitely confirms what we already know, is that the personal, social, political, economic dynamics, whether they are real or perceived, matter in the outcomes of these types of participatory mapping projects. It doesn't matter how well of an administrator you are, or whether your technology is the best, most effective technology out there. If the people in the room don't perceive you as cooperative, they don't trust you, they feel like you don't have their best interests at hand, they're not going to participate effectively, and they're not going to experience that social behavioral change that you wanted them to happen. And this is true across all development projects, not just participatory mapping. So if you take a long history of colonialism and you're a white person and you show up on an island and you say, hey, let's map out your resources. They're like, I'm not telling you where my resources are. Those are mine. I'm going to hide those. And so we really have to understand and think more strategically and do a lot more environmental scans and pre-planning than I think that we are currently doing in the field of participatory mapping. So perceptions matter. And it's not just one perception. It's not just the public's perception. It's every type of stakeholder group's perception in these processes. You have the competing institutions. You have the Wade Institute, who is helping to fund it. So they're also the conveners and funders. You have the government. So you have the local Bermuda Council. They were going through a revolution and a turnover of all of their councilmen due to corruption at the time. You have the Antiguan government, who's maintained power, but then you also have the British government, because there is still a territory of Britain and sit one seat in Parliament, so they're still tied to this colonialist power. You have developers of the technology, like Will McClintock and his staff, who are working diligently to try to engage people with the technology. You have also these other participants who are not even really considered, such as local spiritual leaders, people who are seen as elders in the community, and kind of what they say goes for everyone. And these types of dynamics and who goes into what stakeholder group is not always easily understood. And so it's hard to study. And we have to spend an incredible amount of time really assessing all the different stakeholder groups, their demographic backgrounds, their positionality in society, intersectionality. When do they have the power? When do they not have the power? How does that change dynamics in the room? Well, you're probably thinking, well, how did you evaluate that? Well, I did it through perception surveys. And originally, they were supposed to be pre, during, and post, so that you would have a fluid, ongoing data collection methodology that would let administrators know in real time what the perceptions were. Now, obviously, there's a level of trust that needs to be built between the administrators and the public for them to answer honestly. But for at least the Bermudans, when they were upset, they told you. So you didn't have to worry about that. The other big thing is that with this real-time methodology, when you do it and you conduct an evaluation in real time, the funder can't backtrack and be like, oh, now you can't come in because the outcome is bad. We don't want you to know about the outcome. If you wait till the post-evaluation, they already know whether or not it was successful. They're not going to invite outside external impartial evaluators post hoc if they already know that they didn't do what they were supposed to do or that they failed in their outcome. So doing real-time analysis provides us with a more clear understanding of what actually occurred. And it can help administrators in real time assess whether or not they need to spend more time with one group building consensus. And for me, I have a master's degree in conflict resolution. It's important to me that we build consensus and mediate between these different conflicts and try to build trust and cooperation amongst the participants. So that's why I try to get other participatory mapping practitioners to adopt a real-time research framework of evaluation. Now, another thing which is really interesting. So when I came back from Bermuda and I was like, I can't use any of my research because they just didn't want to answer my questions or they didn't have answers to my questions. I took those questions and put them into a survey. The survey was sent to the 3,400 or 3,247 people. And we only got 114 responses back, so 4% response rate, which is nowhere near the 12% that we idealize in statistics. But what I could see was that perceptions were negative perceptions were related higher to those who had not touched the technology. They reported that they had less understanding of the outcomes on average. So what that means is through the analysis that the technology makes, it becomes unclear to them how the data that was taken from them, the information they provided, the researcher, was just put into a computer and then spit out some results. Well, that's not actually what occurred, right? We know that they used a specific analysis, it was extremely impartial, and they can't see that. They didn't have the understanding and they didn't touch the technology. So to them, it just seemed boring and bizarre. How did you get from point A to point B with what we gave you? And this kept reoccurring throughout. So we know that when it comes to technologies, They also had a lot of questions about, well, who chose the technology to begin with? Why did we go with C-Sketch and not a different technology? Because they weren't actually engaged in bottom-up design, where they get to choose their instruments. It was thrusted upon them. The methodology was chosen and selected for them before they even conducted. And so they were asking for a more bottom-up design so that they can engage. And then they wanted this computer interaction. And so we're hoping now with C-Sketch 2.0 that Will McClintock's lab will be able to assess more, because the goal for his lab is to, if it's true, to show people that engaging the technology increases the likelihood of behavioral change. And so I'm working with other software developers in evaluating participatory mapping perceptions in stakeholder groups. And lastly, this really, as all good research does, just creates a lot more questions than answers. We really want to know, how do we engage the public in resource decision-making when the decision-making scenario is so rapidly changing? If we're out here trying to solve environmental issues, but the rest of the world is harming the environment, how can we make decisions about resource allocation if those resources aren't going to be there in 10, 20 years? Is it a waste of money and time to be working on this? Is there a different approach that we could take? Now, how do we educate funders in a way that makes them more perceptive to the actual needs of the public? And this is an ongoing question that I've had since working in international development for the last 10 years. Is why do developers want to hone in and focus on one thing? They want to be known for that speciality. They don't actually listen. They go in and they say, here's your problem, we're going to fix it, instead of what is your problem? And so how can we educate them better so that in the future, they will listen to the experts on the ground instead of going in with an idea that they want to solve? The third question is, how do we manage the social, economic, and political dynamics that are internal to corrupt regimes? It's incredibly difficult. There really isn't an uncorrupted government structure in the world. Corruption is just human nature. So how do we engage it in a more honest and frank way? Because we can't just ignore that these dynamics are happening and that they have a real life impact on our research. The fourth is, how do we satisfy the public's need to use for participatory design without remaking the wheel or wasting people's time? Because I know that there are hundreds of participatory mapping software being created right now. I've talked to their developers, and really the problem that we're having is that the consumers, the public, more specifically in this case, like indigenous people, they don't trust anyone else to build their software for them. So we're seeing a lot of time and energy used to recreate software all the time. So how can we create software that allows them to actually build their own frameworks, to host the information themselves, and to engage the public in a way that makes them trust where the information is being collected, stored, and analyzed? Lastly, how do we as researchers grapple with perceptions of research subjects? And what about our own perceptions and positionality as researchers? For me, this isn't the first time that I'm going to go conduct research in a different place that I had never been. And when I took my research agenda there, they said, this isn't a problem for us. I came in with my own perceptions of what the problem was, even though I had engaged some people, but oftentimes the people you engage are technical experts, they're higher social economic status, so they're easier to connect with. But when you actually get on the ground and you start talking to people who aren't high up in society, who aren't in the government, who aren't well educated, they have a completely different perspective of what's actually happening on the ground and what needs to be done about it. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with their perceptions of us and our perceptions of them? Because I know for sure that being a small white woman from America brings in a lot of perceptions that some of them are true and some of them are false. And for a lot of a lot of fields out there, particularly in the physical science, it's still kind of discouraged to engage people in this conversation of how does my positionality impact my research? And we can't lie and continue to pretend that it doesn't, because that creates and falsifies information in research in a way that can actually lead to outcomes that aren't necessarily factual or true. So this is my dissertation in a nutshell. I really, really appreciate you stopping in and talking about it. I think we're going to open up to questions from the audience for the next 30 minutes, correct? All right. Thank you. All right. So do I unmute this? Yeah, I have to let them talk. Yes, we have to let them talk too. Yeah, it's still recording, I think. All right. Does anyone have any questions? If you could unmute your mic or throw it in the chat, we'll go ahead and look through it and make sure that we talk about it. Hey, I emailed you, Sophia. I need you to come present at Michigan State. Yes, Chris.
So I have a couple of questions. One is sort of a. Hi. Is that better? Great. Chris Wynot, PhD candidate, organization focusing research group called Management. Very interesting work. I have a couple of questions, but I just want to start now with a quick one about the chauffeurs. You know, you're coming in sort of as a helicopter researcher, getting dropped off, doing work. Who were the chauffeurs? Were they local? Were they trained in the tech? Could you give us a sense of how you found the chauffeurs, how you worked with them to get started the process, and sort of the implications of the working through an intermediary in this work? Thanks.
Thank you for that great question. So as I mentioned before, I was unable to go and evaluate a real-time project. And that was actually because in Curacao, the government changed again, and then the project got canceled. So what happened in Barbuda had happened in 2014, years before I had got there. It was supposed to be a post-evaluation in Barbuda and then kind of a current, like, ongoing one in Montserrat. But people in Montserrat were pissed off at the people implementing and didn't want them to actually kick some of them off the island. So it was a very heated exchange, and they said, I don't know if it's going to be safe for you to go to Montserrat and taking around. So the administrators had some local officials that they had. Another one was Caribbean, but some of them weren't. Some of them were also outsiders. A lot of the Wade Institute's researchers are American or European. And so they try to keep people local. The ideal is to have local chauffeurs because it's easier to communicate, pick up on little nuances in behavior and those types of things. Also, having a knowledge of the local environment is really key. So they commissioned environmental scientists from the region who have been studying there for a long time, who had already had trust with the community. The Wade Institute has been working in the Caribbean and in that area for years. So they did have a relationship prior to the implementation of the project with that.
Hi, I'd like to follow Chris's question. I'd like you to reflect, if you could, about the participatory mapping more generally, and give us a sense of how exclusive it really is in terms of race and gender and ethnicity. How white and privileged is the field? And in your experience, what difference, if any, would it make for someone who is non-white, less privileged, to do the kind of work that you're doing?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, academia as a whole is still very white, still very male populated, but now women are actually going and receiving degrees more than men. So that's at least changing. But for this specific field, it was really interesting for me because once we started convening the International Society of Participatory Mapping, which now has 300 members from around the world, the majority of them were still white. They were from higher institutions institutions in Europe predominantly, not even in the United States. And a lot of them, when they were non-white, they were African, not African American, which was also very interesting. I don't think we have a single member that's African American in the society, to be honest. So I think that this technology is still very distant from engaging populations, particularly here in the United States, who are minorities. You'll see that the practitioner base versus the researcher base is much more diverse. Because there are people from different communities, particularly queer LGBT communities from San Francisco and New York City. They've been using this technology to map displacement, harassment for some time in the United States. You see some of this work happening in the Middle East for sexual harassment against women. There are maps out there where you can go and submit sexual harassment information because the local police don't do anything about it. And they want to be able to advocate for victims at the national level and the local legislative level. So it's still, there's a lot of work to be done in engaging non-white communities and participatory mapping in technology. I mean, the literacy rate for like technology and computers is far lower for minority groups. And for example, like even still in the rural communities in the United States, when COVID happened and all of our students had to move to like digital spaces, 26% of residents of my city in Lansing, Michigan, which is the capital of Michigan, did not have access to the internet. So this makes it really difficult to engage in these types of technologies, but there are alternatives. So if you're ever in need of a mapping software, which C-Sketches also can be done now, not online and then updated later, but there's also Mapio, which is being used by environmental scientists in the Amazon and in Africa that actually uses crypt blockchain information to be able to make sure that the data can't be lost or used against them, since a lot of environmentalists in Latin America are murdered every year. So this is actually being used. There's something called counter mapping, which is used to fight against corrupt regimes and help stage protests. And you'll see people using it in those types of spaces as well, which is highly like feminist and very radical. And so there are these like old school kind of technicians who, don't want to use technology at all, still wanting to use hand maps. They mostly work with rural communities. Then you have them who are urbanists who want to use all the technology, but it's really not their work that's having the most impact in my experience. From what I understand, it's the real bottom-up approaches to participatory mapping that end up having the widest kind of impact because it's built and created and owned by the people for the people type situation. I hope I answered that question. Do we have anybody on Zoom who would like to answer a question? Let me see here. All right, so we have a couple of questions, and of course I can't. Let's see here. All right, can you share with us some of the ways in which this very interesting methodology can be useful in relation to global governance and human security? Kind of started talking about it a little bit before in regards to mapping out sexual harassment, different gender dynamics, issues pertaining particularly to minority groups. There's a lot of people using participatory mapping software in Zimbabwe and East Africa to dispute land tenure issues. Indigenous communities are also using it to go to the United Nations Underrepresented Peoples Assembly and saying, like, look, we lived here for hundreds of years, and these are our resources, and we own them, and we have proof that they're there and they're being exploited by outsiders. So in my day-to-day life, I coordinate international development research at Michigan State University, mostly USAID grants, doing development. And we're working on a project right now that uses this software called ODK. And what we're doing is we're working with youth in Kenya to map different community resources and assets that are important to them so that they can have and be empowered by kind of the technology and then also having ownership of what's happening in society. So this is being used by, like I said, by all organizations at every level of society. And it's really useful. I hope that was good. All right, Christine Tosti. What are some thoughts, experiences in addressing healing from elitism and classism in higher education, both here and abroad? Well, it really has a lot to do with financial resources. I mean, I feel very lucky enough that I was offered a ride to be here, a full ride scholarship and a stipend, but the stipend was incredibly low. Me and Chris were union reps here, and I still had to take out student loans. I'm over $100,000 in debt because my family didn't have money to support me through college, and that's something that I'm gonna have to pay off, which is okay because I'm lucky enough. I had the experience and I showed that I could do things in real practice. And so I was given a job that provides you with the benefits to be able to pay those loans back. But a lot of people, particularly if your passion is teaching and in academia, to go back into the system, which is supposed to be helping our career, you can't pay for your loans. So inherently, no matter what we say, no matter how many diversity hires we have or students we give scholarships to, we're still only giving those to the smartest people who oftentimes already have a lot of the resources or more resources than those who aren't testing as high as others. So we really have to rethink how higher education operates at every level of society if we're going to be able to engage people and make them more self-aware, and so that we don't have issues like we have in the United States, where we have a really uneducated population who actually, because they don't understand and because they feel like they're outcast from society, end up doing things that negatively impact everyone. And it's engaging those people that it's going to be most important, and also taking practitioners of conflict resolution and mediation seriously and using their technical expertise in a way that will help build consensus among all people, and then truly listening. Because one thing, and I was talking to a little bit about this the other day, is that we don't really take a restorative justice approach in participatory mapping, which that's not equality. Equity is not equality. We have to be able to give back and give justice to the people who have been wronged, or they're not going to trust us, they're not going to cooperate, we're not going to benefit as a society as a whole. So I hope that was a good answer to your question. All right, let's see, do we have any more? I think that was it. Any other questions in the audience? Go ahead, Sammy.
Thanks. I understand that there part of methodology was also experiment on campus here. I was wondering how it's done that and how that fits in both methodologically in terms of conclusions to the story you just told.
Yeah. Thank you. I didn't want to go too deep into the weeds, but I did do some validity testing for my survey, which is important in survey development work. Not only did I have technical experts in participatory mapping review make a little slight changes to the questions, I also engaged students here at UMass Boston to do kind of a mock scenario. And what I did is I gave them priming cues that we use in social behavioral psychology, to kind of let them know like different dynamics between the groups. So for instance, faculty thought, students didn't really know what they needed, kind of belittled them sometimes, made them feel like they didn't have enough say in decision making. The community residents who felt like they weren't really engaged by the campus at all and were kind of confused as to why they were being engaged about campus development. And then also the staff, who also sometimes feel disenfranchised in regards to decision making by professors and students who usually lead the front. And the whole goal of this mock decision making scenario was to identify green spaces on campus. And so I went off with Michael Johnson, and we found different spaces on campus to be able to map And then we brought in all of the students who had their priming cues, and they acted out in real time these different stakeholder groups. And then I was mediated by another student, not myself, and I kind of more sat in and just observed and looked over the analysis. And in the handout, you'll see the outcomes actually on the last page of that analysis, the perceptions, because my goal was to show that whatever happens in a room can change the perceptions of the different stakeholder groups. And so you see on the last page in that handout that there were changes to different perceptions around cooperation, trust, technology, empowerment, whether or not they thought the planning process was adequately implemented. And in that day, you could actually see like the faculty and the students kind of go at it. And so you could really see as things progressed and as we built consensus, their feelings changed and shifted. While community residents who felt again left out of the conversation and not really up to date about what was happening on campus moved further away from trust and cooperation in the group. And so the charts kind of show this change and that fact that we can actually evaluate these perceptions and changes that occur in real time. So it was from this validity test that I moved forward with my methodology and hope that I would be able to do it in real life. And unfortunately, that just wasn't the case given the situation. Michael, do you think that okay? Do you have another question? Okay.
Oh, actually, yeah, sorry. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about what you think appropriate technology for participatory mapping looks like or could look like.
That's my favorite question. I learned how to code just because I wanted to start building my own mapping software because I was a little dissatisfied with some of it. A lot of it's still clunky. Like if you open up ArcGIS, which is like the main gold standard for GIS technologies, you need to read a few books to be able to operate it. It's not something that's easy. It crashes a lot. It's just so annoying because all of your projects disappear in the blink of an eye. But also it's not really pretty. And we're in an app culture where people want things that are designed to be pretty and engaging and visual. And for a lot of these mapping technologies, as visual as mapping is, they didn't really engage the user in the analysis process. So there's this one mapping company called Carto. They actually show you in real time what happens with the analysis. And for a lot of things, you visualize the mathematical process behind the analytics, which I think is super important because we're not statisticians. You know, we don't have the tools to really understand this, but yet we're expecting people to plug in some information and what pops out is to be true to them. And like I said in the beginning, that it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. If the perception is they didn't like the process for whatever reason, they're not going to change their behavior. And so what's more important to us, being right or managing people's perceptions and making sure that they truly believe that the process is empowering to them, that the results are owned by them, and that they're clear and functional. You know, that's what really matters. So I continue to work with a lot of people at the International Society of Participatory Mapping to create feature standards and also discuss more about visualization and how we can engage participants in the science and do more science education. Yeah, I think I might have another question. Nope, I think that's it. Any other questions? Will, did you want to ask any questions? Stacy?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've got questions. This has been great, Charla. I really just have to start out by thanking you for taking on this topic, and it's been an education for me all along the way. Yeah, I hope I can take some of these lessons and improve the work that I'm doing. I know I can. But I was gonna maybe put you on the spot and ask you to help me make some of my immediate work better. based on what you've discovered and learned. So I'm beginning work in Fiji, Samoa, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Literally today, I'm going to talk with people from each of these countries. They're countries with lots of different languages and cultures within each of them. And all of the governments have an MOU with the Wade Institute to do marine spatial planning and create protected areas. We're starting in 2 weeks with interviews using C-Sketch, now the mobile device, using both local facilitators, teams of facilitators from the local islands, and there'll be largely facilitated interviews, but there's also going to be opportunity for unfacilitated use, and that data is going to feed into this planning process. So I would like your advice. What are your immediate concerns, and what are your key recommendations for how we can implement this new version of the technology to gather this use information that's provided by stakeholders, so that we don't just promote equitable decision making, but we also promote restorative justice?
Yeah, I think that's obviously contextual. All the time, all these different projects are very contextual, but there are some things that practitioners can do and administrators can do to ensure that they adequately understand the dynamics and the situation on the ground. And that would be through third party, or having someone from your team go in without an official title and just be a person and ask these really tough questions about technology. Have you ever used mapping technology? How's computer literacy here? And not just rely on kind of the government sanctioned responses, because if the government's getting money to implement these projects, they're going to tell you that people have the technological literacy to implement all day because they benefit from that result, right? And so it's really important to kind of engage them as kind of a nobody, because I wasn't with the Wade Institute when I was in Bermuda. I was kind of just this crazy girl who was sleeping in a tent in the sand and had a bunch of dogs that followed her around the island and just asked a bunch of weird questions. But they told me things I don't think that they felt comfortable enough sharing with the Wade Institute, because at the end of the day, like a lot of these processes, like we incentivize people to show up. We pay them money, we give them food. They want to show up because they're getting something from it, not because they're maybe actually interested in the research question that we set out. And then also making sure that you assess like the different socioeconomic backgrounds of each of your different stakeholder groups, like who are the minorities? And a lot of times they're invisible. And that's what makes them minorities, because I've been traveled to a few places and there might be some very unique, either tied to religion or to ethnicity, of a group that is literally less than 5%, 1% of the population, but they always get left out. And perhaps they're really engaged with fishing. Perhaps they're really engaged with harvesting different wildlife that you're interested in evaluating. So I just think it's really important. Either you send someone yourself from C-Sketch, don't tell anybody you're there from the Wade Institute. Ask them, have you ever heard of the Wade Institute? Have they did other projects there before? How do people feel about those projects? You could also hire a third-party consultancy. There's a couple out there. There's like the Ross Messon Group, who do political analysis in country, who have people on the ground who can provide additional consulting services on what's actually happening. So I think that the pre-implementation process, that environmental scan, we need to have a much better framework for evaluating what's happening and how it will impact the results of development projects and participatory mapping projects. Hope that was helpful. Thank you. Stacy, did you want to ask anything? I like your background. Stacy's on vacation. I can't see you, so I'm not sure if you're shaking your head yes or no. Oh, you might have lost Stacy. Oh no. Okay. Well, we will work to get Stacy back on. Does anybody else have any other questions before we move into the next process? Okay. Yeah. Well, I wanted to say thank you again for coming, everybody. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and email me at Charla Burnett89@gmail.com. I also just wanted to say, if you didn't like my project, UMass Boston already sent me my diploma by accident. So I guess I'm a doctor now. Yeah, you know all about that, right? Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And please, if you have further questions, get a hold of me. Thank you.
Let's stop the recording.
You guys sent me my diploma. They're like, you have to destroy it.